Have you ever paused to consider whether things had to be the way they are? I mean, could water not have been H2O? Or perhaps even more intimately, could your sensation of pain exist completely independently of any specific activity in your brain? These aren't just abstract thought experiments for late-night philosophy sessions. These questions cut right to the core of how we understand reality itself, how our language connects to that reality, and even what it means to be a conscious being. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into one of the most monumental and influential works of 20th century philosophy, Saul Kripke's Naming and Necessity. This work, delivered originally as a series of lectures back in 1970, absolutely shattered and then reassembled how philosophers thought about language, logic, and, well, the very fabric of metaphysics. It fundamentally reshaped entire fields. Joining us to guide this truly fascinating exploration and to help us navigate Kripke's often dense but incredibly insightful arguments is our resident expert. They have a remarkable ability to illuminate complex philosophical ideas with striking clarity and relatable examples.
Thank you. It's a genuine pleasure to unpack Kripke. His work isn't just about tweaking existing theories, it's about challenging deeply held, almost foundational assumptions that have gone unquestioned for centuries. Before Kripke, many of these ideas were simply considered bedrock. We'll be looking at how he forced us to rethink our understanding of names, how things are identified, and what we truly mean when we talk about the nature of truth itself. It's a journey that really gets you thinking about the world in a new way.
All right, let's unpack this then. Our mission today is to grapple with Kripke's truly revolutionary ideas. We'll start by understanding his concept of rigid designators, this idea that certain words stick to the same thing no matter what. Then we'll dive into a crucial, often conflated distinction, the difference between what we know a priori, sort of, through pure reason, and what is necessary, what simply couldn't be otherwise in the world. And perhaps most surprising, we'll explore how Kripke argues for the existence of necessary a posteriori truths, facts that are necessarily true about the world, but which we can only discover through empirical investigation. We'll explore all of this through a host of fascinating examples, from mythological figures to the scientific essence of things like heat and water, and even the perplexing nature of our own minds. To truly grasp the profound impact of Kripke's arguments, we need to first set the scene. What was the intellectual landscape like before Kripke came along? How did philosophers generally conceive of how names like Aristotle or Napoleon actually refer to things in the world?
That's absolutely the right place to begin. For centuries, particularly with the rise of modern logic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a dominant view emerged, often called the description theory of proper names. This theory was championed by giants like Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. In essence, it posited that a proper name, when we use it correctly, isn't just a direct label. Instead, it functions as a kind of shorthand or an abbreviated form of a more complex, definite description.
A definite description, like
Yeah.
the teacher of Alexander the Great.
Exactly. So, for instance, Frege argued that a name like Aristotle carried with it a sense, and that sense could be captured by a description, such as the greatest philosopher of antiquity and the tutor of Alexander the Great. Russell's view was similar, suggesting that names like Aristotle were essentially disguised definite descriptions referring to whatever individual uniquely satisfied those specific identifying properties. The idea was that the meaning of the name was tied directly to these descriptions, and the name referred to the person who fit them.
So if someone asked you about Napoleon and you replied, Napoleon was the emperor of the French in the early 19th century who was eventually defeated at Waterloo, the description theory would suggest that this is not just telling them about Napoleon, but it's how the name Napoleon actually gets its reference or meaning in the first place. It's like the name is just a convenient placeholder for that full set of descriptive characteristics.
Precisely. And this theory was incredibly appealing for several reasons. It offered a seemingly natural and uniform way to explain how names refer, even in cases where we might not be directly acquainted with the person or object. It also seemed to provide solutions to various philosophical puzzles, such as how we can meaningfully talk about fictional characters, or how identity statements like the morning star is the evening star could be informative if both referred to the same thing. It brought a neat order to the mechanics of language.
That makes a lot of sense. It provides a tidy, logical framework. But Kripke, as you mentioned, felt something was intuitively wrong here. What was his gut feeling about this description theory? Did it align with our natural, everyday intuitions about how names work in conversation?
Kripke felt there was a profound disconnect between this formal theory and our ordinary linguistic practice. He highlighted what he called our direct intuition of the rigidity of names. Let's take the statement we started with. Aristotle was fond of dogs. When you hear that, you immediately think of that specific historical individual, the philosopher. Now, Kripke asks us to imagine a counterfactual situation, a possible world, as philosophers say, where history unfolded very differently.
Okay, like an alternate timeline.
Exactly. Suppose in this alternate history, the man we know as Aristotle never became a philosopher. Maybe he became a carpenter or a merchant or even lived a completely obscure life. He never taught Alexander the Great, never wrote Nicomachean Ethics. If we then utter the statement, Aristotle was fond of dogs, in that imagined scenario, to whom are we referring? Are we still talking about that same specific man, the one who in our world became the famous philosopher? Or does Aristotle in that counterfactual world now refer to whoever did become the greatest philosopher of antiquity, who might be a completely different person?
My gut tells me we're still talking about our Aristotle, the specific individual, just in a different scenario. It feels like the name sticks to the person, not to the job title they held.
Exactly, and that's Kripke's key insight. He formalized this by suggesting that if the statement Aristotle was fond of dogs is true, it is true of that specific man. And if we imagine a counterfactual situation, that same statement describes it truly if and only if the same aforementioned man would have been fond of dogs had that situation obtained. He argues that our ordinary understanding is that names function as labels that stick to the same individual across all possible scenarios where that individual exists, even if all of that individual's properties, accomplishments, or even personality traits change drastically. This, he contends, is the crucial point of divergence from the description theory. The description theory would imply that if the associated descriptions were met by a different person in a different possible world, the name's referent could shift. But Kripke says, no, the referent remains fixed on the individual.
What's fascinating here is that even before delving into the really technical philosophical arguments, Kripke is essentially asking us to trust our linguistic intuition, our common sense about how language works. He's effectively asking, how could we even make the distinction between the person and their properties if our names didn't already allow for that? It's like he's inviting us to look closely at our everyday language and realize it has a deeper, more robust structure than the prevailing philosophical theories had accounted for. It's a powerful move, grounding complex philosophy in our basic experience of talking. Okay, so Kripke is asking us to acknowledge this intuitive stickiness of names. How does he then formalize this intuition? And why is this formal definition so profoundly important for philosophy?
This brings us directly to one of Kripke's most famous contributions, the concept of a rigid designator. He defines a rigid designator as a term that designates the same object in every possible world in which that object exists. If a term doesn't do that, if its referent can change from one possible world to another, then it's a non-rigid or accidental designator. It's important to clarify that this doesn't mean the object has to exist in all possible worlds, just that if it exists in a given possible world, the rigid designator still points to that exact same object. It's a bit like a cosmic GPS that always locks onto the same individual across all hypothetical realities.
Can you give us a really clear example to illustrate that distinction between rigid and non-rigid designators? It sounds like a subtle but crucial difference.
Absolutely. Let's take the name Nixon. Nixon is a rigid designator. If we ask, could Nixon have lost the 1968 election? The answer is, of course, yes. We are talking about that specific man, Richard Nixon, and imagining a world where he lost. In that world, he would still be Nixon, just a Nixon who perhaps pursued a quieter life or never became president. The name Nixon would still unfailingly point to him.
Okay, so Nixon refers to Nixon always.
Right. Now contrast that with the description, the President of the U.S. in 1970. This, Kripke argues, is a non-rigid designator. In our actual world, it refers to Nixon. But if we imagine a counterfactual situation where, say, Hubert Humphrey won the 1968 election and was president in 1970, then the President of the U.S. in 1970 would refer to Humphrey, a different person. The description's referent changes across possible worlds depending on who fulfills that particular role or description.
I see. The description floats, but the name is anchored.
Exactly. Kripke summarizes this beautifully, stating, although someone other than the U.S. president in 1970 might have been the U.S. president in 1970, for example, Humphrey might have, no one other than Nixon might have been Nixon. This distinction between a label that sticks to an individual and a description that picks out whoever fits it is fundamental. It highlights how proper names function as direct labels, or direct points of reference, rather than being shorthand for a bundle of descriptive properties that could, in principle, be met by someone else.
That makes the distinction crystal clear. A rigid designator is like a personal ID card that stays with an individual, while a non-rigid designator is more like a job title that different people can hold. This really clarifies how names operate differently from descriptions. So this idea of what might have been is clearly crucial to a rigid designation. But you mentioned earlier that Kripke also makes another foundational distinction, separating two concepts that many philosophers previously saw as interchangeable, a priori and necessary. Why was it so important to untangle those two?
Precisely. This brings us to another foundational distinction Kripke makes, one that many philosophers, even great ones, had previously conflated for centuries. This is the crucial difference between a priori and necessary truths. Traditionally, many philosophers treated these terms as almost synonymous, or at least intimately linked. Kripke argues this is a profound mistake, because they belong to two entirely different domains of philosophical inquiry.
Different domains. How so?
Well, a priori is an epistemological concept. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know things. So an a priori truth is something that can be known independently of any empirical experience. You don't need to go out and observe the world to know it. A classic example is all bachelors are unmarried. You know this simply by understanding the definition of bachelor. You don't need to survey married men. It's true by virtue of meaning or definition.
Okay, so a priori is about how we know it through reason alone.
Right. Necessary, on the other hand, is a metaphysical concept. Metaphysics is the study of the fundamental nature of reality itself, what is true about the world, independent of our knowledge of it. A necessary truth is one that could not have been otherwise. It is true in all possible worlds. For instance, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is considered a necessary truth. There's no possible world where 2 plus 2 somehow equals 5. It's true, regardless of our experience.
So we're talking about two different dimensions, one about how we know something and the other about how the world fundamentally is. And Kripke is saying they don't always line up. That's a pretty big challenge to a lot of historical philosophy, isn't it?
It absolutely is. He aims to tear apart these two notions that had been so tightly bound. To illustrate the separation, consider Goldbach's conjecture in mathematics. Every even number greater than 2 is the sum of two prime numbers. Now, if this conjecture is true, Kripke argues, it's necessarily true. It couldn't be otherwise. It's a mathematical truth that holds in all possible worlds. But right now, we don't have a proof. Mathematicians haven't definitively proven it one way or another, so we don't know its truth value a priori. We could even conceivably discover it empirically, in a sense, by running a powerful computer that checks every even number up to an astronomically large one without finding a counterexample, leading us to strongly believe it's true even without a formal proof. So here we have a truth that, if true, is necessary, but is not knowable a priori.
That's a great example for a necessary truth that isn't terraria. It shows how the nature of the truth necessary is distinct from how we come to know it, maybe empirically, maybe not yet at all. But what about the other way around? Can something be known a priori, but not be necessary? This feels almost paradoxical. How can we know something just by thinking, but it still could have been different?
This is where it gets really interesting, and it's a pivotal moment in Kripke's argument. He offers a brilliant, yet deceptively simple example, the standard meter stick in Paris. Imagine, as was once the case, that 1 meter is defined as the length of stick S at time 0, referring to a specific physical stick kept under controlled conditions. Now, if someone defines it that way, they know a priori that stick S is 1 meter long at t0. It's true by definition. You don't need to measure it or conduct experiments. You just stipulated it.
So because we've set up the definition, it's known a priori. We haven't gone out and measured anything. We've just declared it to be so. That makes sense.
Exactly. But now for the crucial question. Is this statement, stick S is 1 meter long at TO, necessary? Kripke argues emphatically no. That physical stick S could have been longer or shorter if, for instance, it had been heated or cooled slightly differently. We can easily imagine a possible world where that specific stick, due to different environmental conditions, had a different length at time TUO. So stick S is 1 meter long at TUO is a contingent a priori truth. It's known a priori due to the fixing of reference. You've simply decided that this particular length will be called 1 meter. But it's not necessarily true about the stick itself. The stick, the object, could have had a different length under different circumstances while still being the very same stick.
Wow, okay, hold on. So our very definitions, the things we know a priori because we've defined them that way, can actually pick out something that is itself contingent, something that could have been otherwise. It's almost like our labels can sometimes refer to things that don't have to be that way, even if the label itself is fixed by definition. This really does challenge the traditional conflation. It makes me wonder if our initial definitions can sometimes mislead us about the underlying reality of the things we're defining.
Precisely. This example is pivotal because it shows that just because we fix the reference of a term in a certain way or know something without empirical investigation doesn't mean the fact expressed is necessary. It cleverly demonstrates that the act of fixing reference can be a priori, but the truth about the referent might still be contingent. This clear and forceful separation of a priori and necessity is one of Kripke's most profound contributions, and it opens the door to understanding other surprising categories of truth, categories that have been largely overlooked or considered impossible before. It fundamentally allows him to make powerful arguments about scientific discoveries and, as we'll see, even the nature of the mind.
Okay, so we now have these powerful new tools from Kripke. The idea of rigid designators, names that stick to the same object across all possible worlds, and this vital distinction between what we know a priori and what is necessary. How does Kripke use these insights to directly dismantle the established description theory of proper names? How does he attack that old model?
He essentially argues that the description theory is fundamentally flawed, not just as a theory of meaning for names, but even as a theory of how names fix their reference in the first place. Kripke presents several incredibly compelling thought experiments that intuitively and then logically tear down the description theory. Remember, the description theory says a name refers to whatever uniquely satisfies an associated description, or maybe a cluster of descriptions.
Right, the shorthand idea.
Exactly. One of his most famous thought experiments is the Gödel-Schmidt scenario. Imagine this. Almost everyone believes, and correctly so, that Kurt Gödel discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. Now, suppose, completely unbeknownst to the entire world, a man named Schmidt actually did all the groundbreaking work, and Gödel, perhaps, simply stole the manuscript and claimed credit. If the description theory were true, then when you and I use the name Gödel, and we implicitly associate with the description, the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetics, we would actually be referring to Schmidt, because Schmidt is the one who truly satisfies that description.
But that doesn't feel right at all. If we discovered that Gödel was a fraud, we wouldn't suddenly be talking about Schmidt when we said Gödel. We'd be saying Gödel didn't discover the incompleteness theorem. We'd still be referring to the person Gödel, just with the revised understanding of his life.
Exactly. Our intuition tells us that when we talk about Gödel, we mean Gödel, the historical person, not whoever happens to fit the description, the discoverer of incompleteness, even if all our beliefs about Gödel's accomplishments turn out to be false. We would revise our beliefs about Gödel, saying things like, Gödel did not discover the incompleteness of arithmetic, not Schmidt discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic, and he is Gödel. Our linguistic practice holds the reference firm to the person we intended to name through a social chain, regardless of our possibly erroneous beliefs about their properties or achievements. The name functions as a rigid designator for that individual, not for the description they might or might not satisfy.
So the name points to the person, not the description.
Right. Kripke strengthens this point with a real-world historical example, the Peano-Dedekind case. Many students of mathematics know Peano as a discoverer of a foundational set of axioms for number theory. However, it turns out that Richard Dedekind published a very similar set of axioms first. If the description theory held, then when someone says Peano discovered the axioms, it would implicitly mean whoever discovered these axioms, which would then refer to Dedekind, or perhaps express a trivial truth about Peano if he was the discoverer. But that's not what's happening. We're referring to Peano as the individual, and in this case, holding a false belief about his priority in that discovery. The name Peano doesn't shift its reference to Dedekind just because Dedekind better fits a description we might associate with Peano.
These examples really highlight the disconnect. Our names seem to bypass descriptions, almost directly labeling individuals. What about the idea that names are linked to a cluster of descriptions, not just one? That seems like a reasonable modification, maybe a way to save the theory.
Kripke tackles that too. Even a modified cluster concept theory, which suggests a name refers to an object satisfying most of a cluster of descriptions, falls short. Philosophers like John Searle had proposed that it's a necessary fact that Aristotle, for instance, has the logical sum of properties commonly attributed to him, meaning at least most of those properties must be true of him. Kripke counters this forcefully, saying, it just is not, in any intuitive sense of necessity, a necessary truth that Aristotle had the properties commonly attributed to him.
Can you give an example for that?
Sure. Think about the name Hitler. Most people instantly associate him with immense evil, the Holocaust and World War II. But consider the statement, Hitler might have spent all his days in quiet in Linz, pursuing his early artistic ambitions. This is a perfectly intelligible counterfactual scenario, right? We can imagine it. And when we do, we still refer to that man, Hitler, the specific individual, even in a world where he had none of the properties we typically associate with him. The name Hitler rigidly designates him, the person. If we define Hitler as the man who committed atrocities, then in a world where he was a quiet painter, the name would fail to refer to him, or it would refer to someone else entirely. But our intuition tells us it still refers to him, the same individual, just living a different life. The descriptions are contingent, the name's reference is not.
That makes a lot of sense. The name seems to have a stronger, more direct attachment to the individual than any set of changeable descriptions. But what happens if the descriptions are all false, or if there's no actual individual fitting any of them, like, say, Santa Claus?
This leads to what Kripke calls the no-referent problem for the description theory. The description theory implies that if no single object uniquely satisfies the descriptions associated with a name, then the name simply doesn't refer to anything at all. But Kripke argues this is counterintuitive. We can meaningfully use names like Jonah even if the individuals described never existed, or if all the associated stories are demonstrably false. Biblical scholars, for instance, might debate whether Jonah the prophet was a historical person, and many might disbelieve the fantastical story of him being swallowed by a whale. Yet they are still referring to Jonah the prophet. They're not merely referring to the man who was swallowed by a whale, which might be a description that refers to nobody. The name retains its capacity to refer, even if its associated descriptions are empty or false.
So these examples seem to intuitively and powerfully dismantle the idea that names are just shortcuts for descriptions. It feels like names are doing something much more fundamental. So if names aren't descriptions, what is determining their reference? How do we use names to pick out things in the world at all? This feels like a huge conceptual void that Kripke needs to fill. If it's not descriptions, what is it?
You've hit on the crucial next step. Having demolished the description theory, Kripke offers a powerful alternative, the causal-historical theory of reference. He critiques the individualistic, almost solipsistic picture that often underpins the description theory. The idea that one is isolated in a room, the entire community of other speakers, everything else could disappear, and one determines the reference for himself by saying, by Gödel, I shall mean the man, whoever he is, who proved the incompleteness of arithmetics. Kripke believes that's simply not how reference works for the vast majority of proper names in our everyday language. It's not an individual act of definition.
So what's the alternative? How does it work socially?
Instead, Kripke proposes that a name is established through an initial baptism. This baptism can occur in a few ways. It might be by ostension, meaning pointing to something and saying, I shall call that Hesperus. Or it could be a non-descriptive fixing of reference, where a name is introduced and its referent is stipulated, perhaps with some associated contingent properties, but without those properties becoming its definition. From this initial act of naming, the name is then transmitted down through a chain of communication from speaker to speaker. Each speaker, when they learn and use the name, intends to use it with the same reference as the person they learned it from, thereby preserving the original referent.
So it's not about what I know or believe about the person, but about how I received the name through a historical lineage of speakers, like passing a baton.
Precisely. Think about someone like Richard Feynman, the famous physicist. Many of us use his name, perhaps knowing only that he was a brilliant scientist, without being able to uniquely identify him by his specific theories or groundbreaking contributions to quantum electrodynamics. The man in the street can still refer to Feynman, even if they can't recall a single one of his theories, because their use of the name is causally linked back to Feynman through a historical chain of communication. It doesn't matter if we can't remember who told us about Feynman. The causal chain, the intention to use the name as others before us have, does the work of fixing the reference. It's a social and historical process, not an individual internal mental description.
Okay, that's a very different picture.
It really is. This theory stands in stark contrast to the description theory. It doesn't require a speaker to know any uniquely identifying facts about the referent to use the name correctly, nor does it make the truth of those facts necessary for reference. The reference is maintained through the chain of communication, even if beliefs about the referent change drastically. It effectively shifts the locus of reference from an individual's mental state to a communal, historical linguistic practice. This also solves the no-referent problem quite elegantly. A name can still refer to a specific individual even if all the descriptions we associate with them turn out to be false, as long as there was an initial baptism and a causal chain maintaining the reference.
This shift from descriptions to causal chains for names has profound and far-reaching implications, especially when we consider identity statements. We had touched on this idea earlier. If A and B are rigid designators and the statement AB is true, then it must be necessarily true. But this immediately presents a puzzle, doesn't it? How can an identity be both necessary, meaning it couldn't be otherwise, and yet be something we discover empirically through experience? That seems like a contradiction in terms. How can something have to be true, but we only find out it's true?
This is indeed the point where Kripke introduces one of his most revolutionary and counterintuitive ideas, the concept of necessary a posteriori truths. This category profoundly merges the metaphysical and epistemological in a way that had largely been considered impossible before him. And the paradigm example he offers, the one that really encapsulates this idea, is the identity statement. Hesperus is Phosphorus.
The morning star and the evening star.
Right, exactly. Let's break it down. Hesperus was the name ancient people gave to the bright celestial body seen in the evening sky. Phosphorus was the name they gave to the bright celestial body seen in the morning sky. For a long time, these were thought to be two distinct heavenly bodies. But then astronomers, through careful observation and scientific investigation and empirical process, and a posteriori process, discovered that both names actually refer to the same planet, Venus.
Okay, that's the empirical discovery part.
Right. Now here's Kripke's crucial move. Both Hesperus and Phosphorus are, according to Kripke, rigid designators. They each rigidly designate the planet Venus across all possible worlds where Venus exists. Therefore, if Hesperus is Phosphorus, if they are indeed the same object, then it is necessarily the case that Hesperus is Phosphorus. Their identity holds true in every possible world. The fact that this identity was an empirical discovery, a fact that had to be learned through experience, doesn't make it a contingent truth. Once we discover that these two names refer to the very same object, that identity holds true necessarily. It couldn't have been otherwise.
I think this is where many of us might instinctively pause and think, but it might have turned out otherwise? It feels like it was a contingent fact, something that could have been different. That intuition is really strong. How does Kripke address that feeling?
That's a crucial point, and Kripke anticipates it. He explains that this might have turned out otherwise. Intuition is purely epistemic. It reflects our state of ignorance before the discovery. It's about what we thought was possible, given our limited knowledge, not about what was metaphysically possible in reality. It doesn't mean it was metaphysically possible for Hesperus not to be Phosphorus. It means that, given the qualitative evidence we had, seeing two distinct stars at different times, it was epistemically possible that they were two distinct objects.
So it's about what we knew, not about how things were.
Precisely. Let me put it another way with a simple analogy. Imagine you have a box, and you don't know if there's an apple or an orange inside. It's epistemically possible for you that it's an apple and epistemically possible that it's an orange. You just don't know. But once you open the box and discover it's an apple, it was always an apple in there. It wasn't metaphysically possible for it to have been an orange at that moment. Similarly, with Hesperus and Phosphorus, we could have had qualitatively identical evidence seeing the morning star and evening star, and in some other possible world, they could have turned out to be two distinct objects. But in that world, they simply wouldn't have been Hesperus and Phosphorus as we use those names for our planet Venus. The appearance of contingency lies in our past ignorance, in the path of discovery, not in the metaphysical nature of the identity itself. Once the discovery is made, the identity is fixed and necessary.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. The might was in our heads, not in the world itself. So if I'm understanding correctly, what we learn through empirical experience can indeed be a necessary truth, even if it wasn't knowable from our armchair purely through definition or reason. This fundamentally upends centuries of philosophical thought that largely link necessity with a priori knowledge. This raises an important question. If this applies to proper names and celestial bodies, what about terms for natural kinds or phenomena, like gold or heat? Do those behave similarly? Does water, is H2O work the same way?
That is a brilliant and absolutely essential connection to make, and it's where Kripke extends these ideas even further, deepening their impact on science and metaphysics. He argues that terms for natural kinds like gold, water, tiger, and natural phenomena like heat, lightning behave much like proper names. They are also, he claims, rigid designators, and consequently discoveries about their underlying nature yield necessary a posteriori truths.
So gold isn't just yellow metal.
Exactly. Let's consider gold. Historically, many philosophers, including Kant, might have believed gold is a yellow metal, was an a priori and analytic truth, true by definition, knowable without experience. Kripke vehemently disagrees. He suggests that we could empirically discover that all gold is actually blue due to, say, a pervasive and elaborate optical illusion affecting human perception. We wouldn't then say gold doesn't exist, we'd simply say gold is blue. Similarly, we recognize that fool's gold, iron pyrites, might look exactly like gold, but it's not gold. Why? Because it lacks gold's fundamental underlying internal structure.
It's chemical makeup, right?
Precisely. Through scientific investigation, we have empirically discovered that gold is, in its essence, the element with atomic number 79. This was not something we knew a priori. It was a hard-won scientific discovery. But, Kripke argues, if gold is element 79, then it is necessarily element 79. Any substance lacking this atomic number, no matter how much it resembles gold superficially, its color, its luster, its malleability, is simply not gold. This is a necessary a posteriori truth. The reference of gold was initially fixed by some observable properties, perhaps by pointing to it and saying, that stuff is gold. But its essence was discovered empirically, and that essence turns out to be necessary.
That's a powerful point. It shows that the surface-level characteristics we use to identify something initially aren't necessarily its deep essential properties. What about something like cats? You mentioned that earlier.
The same logic applies. The statement, cats are animals, might initially seem a priori or true by definition. But Kripke, following Hilary Putnam, suggests we could conceivably discover that what we call cats are actually incredibly sophisticated robots, or perhaps even strange, shape-shifting demons disguised as felines. Wild, I know, but...
Okay, a philosophical thought experiment.
Right. If that happened, we wouldn't say cats don't exist. We'd say cats turned out not to be animals after all, as we originally supposed.
Yeah.
But once we've empirically established that cats are animals, which seems pretty solid, then any cat-like robot or demon we might imagine in a counterfactual world isn't a cat. It would be a cat-mimicking robot or a demon masquerading as a cat. The term cat rigidly designates a specific biological kind, and its being an animal, once discovered, becomes a necessary a posteriori truth about that kind.
So the name points to the kind, defined by its discovered essence.
Yes. Let's extend this further to a natural phenomenon like heat. We initially identify heat by the sensation it produces in us, that feeling of warmth or burning. But Kripke argues that the scientific discovery heat is molecular motion is a necessary a posteriori truth. We came to know this through empirical investigation, not by definition. We can imagine a situation where humans were entirely insensitive to molecular motion. Heat as molecular motion would still exist. Or we could imagine some alien creatures where sound waves rather than molecular motion caused the sensation of heat. But those sound waves wouldn't be heat. They would simply cause the sensation of heat in those beings. The term heat rigidly designates the phenomenon of molecular motion, regardless of how it's detected or felt. The sensation helps us fix the reference initially, but it doesn't define the essence of heat. The essence is the molecular motion itself, and that identity is necessary.
This is truly mind-bending. The same reasoning, then, would apply to water is H2O and lightning is an electrical discharge. These are scientific discoveries, empirical in nature, yet if true, they are necessarily true because the terms water, lightning rigidly designate those underlying scientific realities. H2O, electrical discharge.
Absolutely. Kripke's general argument here is that the way we fix the reference of a term, whether by initial appearances, sensations, or ostension, pointing at it, is often a contingent a priori matter, like the meter stick. We know that the length of stick S is 1 meter because we defined it that way, but the stick itself could have been a different length. However, what that term actually refers to once discovered for proper names, natural kinds, and phenomena leads to necessary or posteriori truths. This challenges the deeply ingrained intuition that anything known empirically must be contingent. It creates this fascinating and powerful intersection between what we discover through science and what is fundamentally necessarily true about reality. It implies that science isn't just giving us a set of contingent facts about the world, but is actually revealing its essential, necessary structure.
This is truly fascinating, how Kripke's framework connects language and the world in such a profound new way. It makes us rethink the very nature of scientific discovery. But where does this incredibly robust framework leave some of the biggest and most enduring philosophical questions, especially those about the relationship between our minds and our bodies? The mind-body problem.
This is arguably one of the most powerful and certainly one of the most widely debated applications of Kripke's entire framework. He uses these distinctions to directly challenge the mind-body identity thesis. This is a prominent view in philosophy of mind that claims mental states like experiencing pain or seeing red are identical to specific physical states of the brain, such as, say, C-fiber stimulation. Many identity theorists had argued these were contingent identities, similar to the inventor of bifocals as Benjamin Franklin. The idea was that just as Franklin could have existed without inventing bifocals, a brain state could exist without being a pain, and vice versa. They believed this apparent contingency allowed for the identity while still acknowledging our strong intuition that mental states seem distinct from physical ones.
So the identity theorists wanted to say that pain is C-fiber stimulation, but they felt they had to make it a contingent identity to account for our intuition that it could have been otherwise. But if pain and C-fiber stimulation are both rigid designators, which they seem to be, then any identity between them must be necessary, right? This is where Kripke's framework throws a wrench into their argument.
Exactly. That's Kripke's starting point for his critique. He argues that pain is a rigid designator of the phenomenon of pain itself. If something is a pain, it is essentially so. It seems intuitively absurd to think that pain could have been something other than pain. Its very essence is that distinct, unpleasant, phenomenological quality we experience. Similarly, assuming C-fiber stimulation is also a rigid designator, referring to a specific physical state, say, a particular pattern of neural activity, then if pain is C-fiber stimulation is true, it must be a necessary truth, not a contingent one. This means there could not be C-fiber stimulation without pain, nor pain without C-fiber stimulation if they are genuinely identical. They would have to be the same thing in all possible worlds where they exist.
This is a surprising and, as you said, counterintuitive conclusion for many. The contingency of the connection between our mental states and our brain states feels so intuitively obvious. We can easily imagine a brain state occurring without the accompanying pain, or even a pain existing without that specific brain state. So how does Kripke argue that the identity theorists can't simply use the same strategy we saw with heat as molecular motion to explain away this apparent contingency? Because with heat, we said the sensation of heat was contingent, but heat itself, molecular motion, was necessary. Can't they do the same for pain? Say the feeling of pain is contingent, but pain is the brain state.
This is Kripke's absolutely crucial and devastating move against the identity thesis. He argues that the analogy fails for pain. Let's recall how we explained away the apparent contingency of heat as molecular motion. We said that someone could have had the sensation of heat even if it wasn't caused by molecular motion, perhaps by sound waves in some alien species. The reference of heat was fixed by an accidental property. It's causing a specific sensation in us. But heat itself, the underlying phenomenon, was necessarily molecular motion. The sensation was just how we identified heat.
Right. The sensation was separable from the thing itself.
But pain, Kripke argues, is fundamentally different. Pain is not picked out by one of its accidental properties. Its reference is determined by its immediate phenomenological quality. It's picked out by being pain itself. To be in an epistemic situation qualitatively identical to having a pain is to have a pain. There's no appearance of pain beyond the pain itself. You cannot separate the sensation of pain from pain itself in the way you can separate the sensation of heat from molecular motion or the appearance of gold from its atomic structure. If you are having the sensation of pain, you are having pain. There's no further underlying essence beyond that experience. Pain simply is that experience.
So there's no gap between the feeling and the thing.
That's exactly. Kripke offers a vivid thought experiment, a classic God scenario, to drive this point home. He says, suppose we imagine God creating the world. To make heat molecular motion, God creates the molecular motion. To make it felt as heat by conscious beings, God then creates sentient beings with the right sensory apparatus. But the molecular motion itself is heat, regardless of whether it's felt or not. There's a clear separation here between the phenomenon and its experience. Now, for pain, equal C-fiber stimulation, however, it's different. To create C-fiber stimulation, God just creates the physical state. But to make that C-fiber stimulation correspond to pain or be felt as pain, God would seem to have to do something in addition. As Kripke puts it, he must let the creatures feel the C-fiber stimulation as pain and not as a tickle or as warmth or as nothing, as apparently would also have been within his powers. If God has to do this additional work, if the correlation isn't automatic and inherent in the brain state itself, then the C-fiber stimulation and the pain cannot be identical. Because if they were identical, the stimulation could not exist without the pain, and vice versa. The apparent possibility of separating the C-fiber stimulation from the sensation of pain, even in a divine creation scenario, implies they're not the same thing.
Wow. So if I understand the critical difference here, with heat, the sensation is merely a contingent symptom or mode of identification of heat. But with pain, The sensation is the pain itself, its essential quality. Therefore, if the mind-body identity thesis were correct, the correspondence between a specific brain state and a mental state would have to be absolutely necessary, without any possible separation. But a strong intuition suggests this correlation is contingent. It seems entirely possible for a specific brain state to occur without the corresponding pain, or for pain to exist without that specific brain state. Because the analogy with scientific identities like heat and molecular motion doesn't hold due to the essential nature of pain, Kripke argues that the mind-body identity thesis faces a profound, perhaps insurmountable challenge. He suggests this intuitive element of contingency in the mind-body connection, far from being an illusion to be explained away like the apparent contingency of Hesperus being phosphorus, actually tells heavily against the usual forms of materialism. What a profound deep dive this has been. We've journeyed through Saul Kripke's truly revolutionary ideas. From the steadfast nature of rigid designators always pointing to the same object across possible worlds, to the surprising and counterintuitive existence of necessary truths that we can only discover through empirical experience. This framework, so elegantly laid out, has profound implications not just for the academic realm of philosophy, but for how we understand science, language, and even our own deepest experiences.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Kripke's work fundamentally reorients our understanding of how language truly hooks onto reality. He shows us that our words aren't just flexible labels we attach based on descriptions that can change. They're tied to objects and kinds in a much more fundamental, almost essential way. This shift forces us to distinguish carefully between what we know and what is truly the case in all possible worlds. It encourages critical thinking about the obvious connections we make every day, revealing that many of them are far more complex and nuanced than they first appear. It really teaches us to be precise in our thinking about possibility and actuality,
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Kripke's work teaches us to be incredibly cautious about what we assume to be a priori or necessary. It invites us to question whether our current scientific understanding of reality is not just a contingent set of facts, but a discovery of the necessary essence of things. That gold is atomic number 79, that water is H2O, and that these are not just empirical facts but necessary truths about those substances. And perhaps most provocatively, Kripke's arguments challenge us to reconsider the very nature of our own conscious experience. If pain is essentially pain, and a brain state is essentially a brain state, and they can seemingly exist independently, then what does that truly say about who or what you are? Does your experience of consciousness transcend the purely physical, or is there another explanation that Kripke's framework illuminates? That's a question for another deep dive, or perhaps for your own ongoing reflection. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring.